A Little Princess. Chapter 1. Sara Goes to School. On a dark winter's day, a little girl sat in a cab with her father. She stared out the window as the cab drove through foggy London. Sara Crewe was only 7, but she seemed much older. She was always dreaming and thinking. At that moment, she was thinking about her long trip from India. She had just arrived in London with her father. It felt strange to travel from a hot, sunny place and arrive in a cold, dark one. Soon the cab stopped in front of a big brick house. A brass sign on the front door said, "Miss Minchin's boarding school for young ladies."
"Papa, is this the place?"
Sara whispered.
"Yes,"
he replied.
"we have reached it at last."
Sara's mother had died when Sara was born. Sara's father was an officer in the British Army. He was very rich and handsome and gave Sara whatever she wanted. Sara had lots of toys and clothes. Servants took care of all her needs. In India, she'd had only one worry. Her father believed that the climate in India wasn't healthy. So one day, he would send her to school in England. And now that day had come. Captain Crewe knocked on the door of the school. A servant answered and led them inside. Sara looked around at the ugly sitting room with its heavy wooden furniture.
"I don't like it here, Papa,"
she said.
"But soldiers probably don't like going into battle either."
Captain Crewe laughed.
Oh, Sara, you say such wonderful things. What will I do without you?
He swept her into his arms for a hug. A moment later, the headmistress, Miss Minchin, entered the room. The headmistress had large fishy eyes and a large fishy smile. Sara thought the woman looked just like her school, tall, dull, ugly. Miss Minchin knew that Captain Crewe was rich. She tried to please him by praising Sara.
"What a beautiful child!"
the headmistress exclaimed.
"But I'm not beautiful,"
Sara thought.
"Miss Minchin is making that up."
Sara stood quietly near her father while he and the headmistress talked. Because Sara's father was very rich, Sara would have many nice things at school. There would be a pretty bedroom and sitting room and a pony and carriage. A maid would help her.
Sara reads too much.
Captain Crewe told the headmistress.
Make sure she goes outside. She should ride her pony or buy some new dolls.
"Oh, Papa,"
said Sara.
"I don't need a lot of new dolls. I only need Emily."
"Who's Emily?"
asked Miss Minchin.
Tell her, Sara.
Captain Crewe said, smiling.
"She's a special doll that Papa is going to buy for me,"
said Sara.
"She'll be my friend when Papa is in India. I'll talk to her about him."
Miss Minchin's large fishy smile grew wider.
"What an unusual child!"
she exclaimed loudly.
"She's such a darling girl."
Yes,
said Captain Crewe. He pulled Sara close.
She is truly a darling girl. Please take very good care of her for me, Miss Minchin.
"Oh, I will,"
the headmistress promised. Sara stayed with her father at his hotel for several days. He bought her all kinds of expensive clothes, velvet dresses, fur coats, silk stockings. They searched many toy shops looking for Emily, but couldn't find her.
"She has to be a doll who can listen to me, Papa,"
explained Sara.
"Most dolls don't really seem to hear."
So they looked at big dolls and little ones, at dolls with black eyes and dolls with blue ones, They looked at dolls with brown curls and golden braids, dolls in all kinds of clothing. But none of them was quite right. Then one day, Sara spotted a doll with golden brown hair and an intelligent expression.
Look, Papa! There's Emily!
She cried. They went into the shop and bought the doll. Then they went to a dressmaker to order a grand wardrobe for Emily. Finally, the day came when Captain Crewe had to leave. He and Sara were very sad. From her window, Sara watched him get into a cab. Emily was by her side. Miss Minchin sent her sister, Miss Amelia, to check on Sara.
Why is this door locked?
Asked Miss Amelia.
I want to be alone, please,
Said Sara softly. Miss Amelia went downstairs and told Miss Minchin about how Sara was acting.
I've never seen such an odd child,
Said Miss Amelia.
She has locked herself in her room, but she's not making any noise at all. She's very spoiled,
Snapped Miss Minchin.
I'm surprised she isn't kicking and screaming. All those new clothes are absolutely ridiculous. Her father treats her like a little princess.
A Little Princess, Chapter 2, First Day of Class. The next morning, Sara had a long talk with her doll, Emily, about her father.
Papa is traveling on the sea now,
Said Sara. Emily said nothing, but Sara was sure the doll was listening.
I believe that dolls have secrets.
Sara told her maid, Mariette.
Perhaps Emily can read and walk and talk. But she only does those things when no one is watching her.
Mariette smiled at Sara.
It's time for school.
Just a minute, please,
Sara replied. She went to Emily and gave her a book.
You can read this while I'm in class,
She said to the doll.
What an odd child,
Mariette thought as she and Sara went downstairs. But Mariette knew she would like her new job as Sara's maid. Sara was very kind and polite and had charming manners,
She's almost like a little princess,
thought the maid. By the time Sara entered the classroom, everyone was talking about her.
She has so many fancy clothes,
Lavinia Herbert whispered to her best friend Jessie.
I passed her room last night. Her maid was opening a suitcase full of lace petticoats. She's wearing one now. I saw it when she sat down.
Lavinia was nearly 13 and thought of herself as almost grown up.
I heard Miss Minchin say it's absolutely ridiculous for a child to have such fancy clothes,
She said.
I agree with her. My mother says that children should always dress simply.
The two girls pretended to read their geography books, but they were really sneaking looks at Sara.
She's wearing silk stockings.
Whispered Jessie.
What tiny feet she has. I don't think she's pretty at all,
Lavinia sniffed.
Her eyes are such a strange color. But there's something about her that makes you keep looking at her,
Said Jessie.
Her eyelashes are so dark and long, and her eyes are almost green.
Meanwhile, Sara sat quietly watching the other girls, who were still staring at her.
Young ladies,
Said Miss Minchin.
I'd like to introduce you to your new classmate, Miss Sara Crewe.
All the girls stood up, and Sara did too.
I expect you to be nice to Miss Crewe. She's just come to London from India. After lessons are over, you will have time to get acquainted with Sara.
The girls bowed to Sara, who curtsied in reply.
Come here, Sara,
said Miss Minchin as the other girls sat down. Sara obediently went to Miss Minchin's side.
Your father hired a French maid for you,
said the headmistress.
He must want you to learn French.
Sara felt a little awkward.
I think he just thought that I'd like Mariette,
she replied politely. Miss Minchin frowned.
You sound very spoiled. People don't always do things just to make you happy, Sara. Your father clearly wants you to learn French.
Sara flushed, unsure of what to say. Her mother had been French. Her father had loved her mother and had often spoken French to Sara. But Miss Minchin looked so mean. Sara didn't know how to explain things to her.
I've never actually studied French,
Sara began.
but
Well, then it's time you started to study it,
the headmistress said impatiently. Miss Minchin herself had never learned to speak French, but this was an embarrassing secret that she didn't intend to share with anyone.
Here's our French teacher now.
She added sharply.
Everyone, take out your French books.
Monsieur Defarge looked like a nice, intelligent man. When he saw Sara, he smiled.
Is this a new pupil for me, madame?
He asked.
Her father, Captain Crewe, is very eager for her to learn the language, but I'm afraid that Sara seems less eager to learn.
Miss Minchin replied with a frown. Sara rose in her seat, suddenly feeling a bit desperate. She felt sure that she could explain her situation to Monsieur Defarge. And she did exactly that, speaking to him in perfect French. Miss Minchin started quite violently, and then she glared at Sara. But Monsieur Defarge was already charmed by the girl who spoke his language so beautifully.
Ah, Miss Minchin.
He said.
There isn't much I can teach Sara. She hasn't studied French. She is French.
Miss Minchin's cheeks flushed.
You should have told me.
The headmistress snapped at Sara.
I tried.
Said Sara.
I guess I should have tried harder.
Lavinia and Jessie giggled from behind their French books. Sara had made the headmistress look a bit foolish.
Silence, young ladies.
Miss Minchin rapped on her desk.
Silence!
And from that moment on, she began to dislike her new student. A Little Princess, Chapter 3, A New Friend. That first morning at school, Sara noticed a plump, blonde girl about the same age as Sara. The girl was chewing on the ribbon of her pigtail and staring at Sara. When Monsieur Defarge spoke to Sara, the plump girl looked a little frightened. When Sara replied in French, the girl gave a startled jump and turned red. Miss Minchin was still in a bad mood about Sara's perfect French.
Miss St. John, stop chewing on your ribbon and sit up at once,
she snapped. The girl gave another startled jump. Lavinia and Jessie giggled, and the girl turned redder than ever. Sara's father often remarked on Sara's soft heart. Sara always wants to fight when she sees people in trouble, he liked to say. And that was certainly true now.
Those girls shouldn't laugh,
thought Sara.
That's mean.
But Lavinia and Jessie continued to snicker when the girl spoke in French for Monsieur Defarge. Sara felt sorry for this girl, who had such trouble saying the French words correctly. The French lessons were obviously quite difficult for her. When the morning's lessons were finally finished, the plump girl sat on a window seat, looking miserable. Sara went over to her.
What's your name?
Asked Sara. The girl seemed amazed that Sara was talking to her.
My name is Ermengarde St. John,
she replied.
Mine is Sara Crewe. What a pretty name you have.
exclaimed Sara.
It sounds like a name from a story.
I like your name too. Where did you learn to speak French?
Ermengarde asked.
Oh, I've done it all my life.
Sara answered.
If you'd always heard French at home, you could do it too.
No, I don't think so,
said Ermengarde sadly.
I'm not very smart.
Ermengarde explained that her father spoke 7 or 8 languages. He had a huge library filled with thousands of books and couldn't understand why Ermengarde didn't do well in school. He had told Miss Minchin that Ermengarde must be made to learn. But at school, Ermengarde was often in trouble or in tears.
You're smart, aren't you?
Ermengarde said to Sara. Sara looked out the window into the dirty square. She could see some sparrows hopping along iron railings. She thought for a minute.
Oh, I don't know.
Then suddenly she changed the subject.
Would you like to meet Emily?
Who's Emily?
Asked Ermengarde.
Come up to my room and see,
replied Sara. Ermengarde followed Sara upstairs.
Is it true,
she asked,
that you have a playroom all to yourself?
Yes.
Sara answered.
Papa asked Miss Minchin to let me have one. It's because I like to tell myself stories, and the mood gets spoiled if I know people are listening.
Sara stopped outside the door to her room.
If we're quiet, maybe we'll catch her,
she said mysteriously. Ermengarde blinked. She had no idea what Sara was talking about. But Sara's eyes were full of fun. Ermengarde couldn't wait to see what happened. Sara threw open the door. Ermengarde saw a beautiful doll sitting on a chair in front of the fire.
Oh, Emily is back in her seat.
Sara sounded disappointed.
Can she walk?
Asked Ermengarde in surprise.
I like to pretend she can,
said Sara.
Don't you pretend such things?
No.
Ermengarde was in awe of this strange girl.
Never. May I hold Emily?
Of course,
said Sara.
And I'll tell you stories.
So they sat together, her green eyes shining. Sara told Ermengarde all about the secret life of dolls. She also talked about life in India and the voyage to England. When Sara got to the part about finding Emily in the toy shop, she suddenly looked upset. Ermengarde had the feeling that Sara was bravely trying not to cry.
What's wrong?
She asked in alarm.
Do you love your father more than anything in the world?
Sara burst out. Ermengarde thought this was a strange question.
I hardly ever see him. He's always in his library reading things.
Oh, I love my father and miss him so.
Sara buried her head in her hands. Ermengarde's mouth fell open a little. Sara was so wonderful and different from anyone else. Sara lifted her head.
If I keep telling you stories, I won't miss him as much.
Tears came to Ermengarde's eyes, and she felt a lump in her throat.
Lavinia and Jessie are best friends. Do you think we could be best friends? You're so smart, and I'm not smart at all, but I like you very much.
Of course we can be best friends,
said Sara. Her face lit up.
And do you know what, Ermengarde? I can help you with your French lessons.
A Little Princess. Chapter 4. Lottie's Mother. Miss Minchin disliked Sara, but the headmistress didn't want to make Sara unhappy. If that happened, Sara's rich father might take Sara out of the school. So the headmistress always praised Sara for her good manners and kindness to the other girls. She always let Sara do whatever she liked. and quiet Sara never did anything to break the rules.
Lots of things just happen by accident.
Sara said to Ermengarde one day.
I'm just lucky that my father is kind and rich. I'm also lucky that I learn new things easily. Maybe,
She went on thoughtfully.
I'm really an awful child. But I'll never know because I don't have any problems.
Lavinia doesn't have any problems and she's horrid.
Said Ermengarde. Sara rubbed her nose as she considered this. Then she tried to be kind by repeating something she'd heard Miss Amelia say.
Maybe Lavinia is horrid because she's growing so fast.
But Sara had to admit that Lavinia was indeed horrid. Lavinia was also jealous of Sara. Before Sara came, Lavinia had been the best-dressed girl at school and Miss Minchin's favorite. She ruled over the older girls and scared the younger ones. All the girls followed her because they were afraid not to. But then Sara arrived. Although Sara was rich, she was friendly. And as time went on, the other girls began to follow her because they liked her. The youngest girls adored her because she was kind to them. She hosted tea parties in her room and introduced them to Emily. Unlike Sara, Lavinia was rarely kind to the younger girls. One morning, Sara heard Lottie crying and shouting in the main sitting room. Lottie was 4 years old, the youngest girl at school. Lottie's father had spoiled her after her mother died. If Lottie wanted something, she cried until she got it. If she didn't want to do something, she threw a tantrum. Miss Minchin and Miss Amelia were trying to calm Lottie down.
Why is she upset now?
Miss Minchin yelled over the noise. Sobbed Lottie.
I don't have a mama!
Don't cry, darling, said Miss Amelia.
Haven't got a mama!
Howled Lottie.
You only say that when you can't have your way,
Said Miss Minchin.
You really should be whipped, you naughty child.
Lottie wailed louder than ever. Miss Amelia began to cry. Miss Minchin got so angry, she stormed out of the room and left her sister to deal with the problem. Sara was standing in the hallway.
Oh, Sara.
Miss Minchin forced herself to give Sara a nice smile.
I stopped because I heard Lottie.
Said Sara.
Perhaps I could help her?
Miss Minchin's expression changed slightly.
You are a clever child.
She said in a sharp tone. Then she softened her voice.
Go ahead. You can't do any worse than my sister is doing.
Sara entered the room and found Lottie kicking and screaming on the floor. Miss Amelia was bending over her, looking hot and tired. Poor darling, murmured Miss Amelia a few times. Then she said in quite a different tone, Stop it, Lottie, you're a wicked child!
Miss Amelia,
Sara said quietly.
Miss Minchin says I may try to make her stop.
Miss Amelia turned and looked at her. Oh, do you think you can? She gasped. Lottie is such a dreadful child.
If you'll quietly leave the room, I'll see what I can do,
promised Sara. Miss Amelia slipped out, leaving the two girls alone. Sara said nothing, and she did nothing. She simply sat quietly on the floor next to Lottie. Lottie didn't know what was going on. She looked up at Sara.
I haven't got a mama!
She tried to wail.
Neither do I,
said Sara. This was so surprising that Lottie sat up.
Where is your mama?
Both our mamas are angels in heaven.
Sara answered.
Should I tell you about heaven?
Lottie dried her tears.
Yes, please.
Sara told her a story of a beautiful place filled with happy angels and fields of flowers.
But I don't mama here at this school,
said Lottie. Sara reached for Lottie's hand.
I'll be your mama,
She said.
and Emily will be your sister.
Lottie smiled happily.
Let's go tell Emily.
Yes, and then I'll brush your hair for you.
Added Sara. Lottie happily agreed and trotted upstairs after Sara. By now, Lottie had completely forgotten what had first upset her. Miss Amelia had tried to brush her hair. A Little Princess, Chapter 5, The Kitchen Maid. Three years passed, and Sara was still at Miss Minchin's school. One winter afternoon, Sara returned from a drive in her carriage. As usual, she was dressed in her warmest velvets and furs. A dirty child stood in the stairway leading to the school's kitchen. Sara smiled at her.
Hello.
The girl looked frightened and darted into the kitchen.
She must be a servant here.
Sara thought. That evening, Sara was telling stories to girls in the schoolroom. Sara's gift at telling stories was, of course, the greatest power that she had. When she sat in a circle and began to invent things, her green eyes grew big and began to shine. Her cheeks flushed and her hands fluttered as she told the tale. The young servant girl came in to tend the fire. Everyone was listening intently, even Lavinia. She was very jealous of Sara's ability to tell stories.
The mermaids swam about in the green water.
Sara went on.
A princess watched them from the shore.
Sara noticed that the servant was working slowly in order to listen. She swept the hearth in front of the fire, and then swept it again. Sara began talking louder so the girl could hear. The servant girl was so interested in the story that she suddenly dropped her dustpan.
That servant was listening,
cried Lavinia as the girl fled. Sara felt a flash of anger.
I knew she was listening. I don't mind.
Well, you should mind,
Lavinia said. That night, Sara asked Mariette about the servant girl.
Her name is Becky,
Replied Mariette.
She's the kitchen maid and has to work very hard. All day long, she scrubs floors and cleans windows and carries heavy things up and down the stairs. She's very timid, and all the other servants are cruel to her. They constantly order her around.
Oh, the poor girl,
said Sara. After Mariette left, Sara thought about Becky for a long time. She even made up some stories about the hard-working servant girl. One evening, several weeks later, Sara entered her room and found Becky asleep in her chair.
Oh,
Cried Sara softly.
there she is.
Sara sat down and watched Becky sleep for a moment.
Miss Minchin would be angry if she found out about this. But the poor girl looked so tired. I'll let her sleep for just a few more minutes.
But then, a flaming piece of coal broke off and fell on the hearth. The sound startled Becky, who opened her eyes with a frightened gasp. She sprang up and straightened her cap. Then she caught sight of Sara and her eyes widened. Surely Becky would lose her job now.
Oh, I'm so sorry, miss,
She cried.
I didn't mean to fall asleep in your chair. I just sat down for a minute.
It's all right.
Sara laughed and put her hand on Becky's shoulder.
You were tired. You couldn't help it.
Becky stared at Sara. No one had ever spoken to her in such a kind and friendly way.
Aren't you angry, miss?
She gasped.
Aren't you going to tell Miss Minchin?
Of course not.
Sara reached out and touched Becky's cheek.
We're really the same, you and I. We're both just children. It's only luck that I'm not you and you're not me.
Becky didn't know how to respond to this. She just said, "Yes, miss."
Have you finished your work? Can you stay a few more minutes?
Sara asked.
Here, miss? Me?
Yes. I thought you might like a piece of cake.
The next 10 minutes seemed like a dream to Becky. Sara opened a cupboard and gave her a thick slice of cake. Sara talked and laughed and asked Becky questions. Becky began to calm down. She admired the beautiful pink dress that Sara was wearing.
Once I saw a princess outside the opera house,
said Becky.
You look just like her in that dress.
Sara laughed.
I think I'll start pretending to be a princess.
Sara knew that princesses often gave gifts to other people. She knew exactly the sort of gift that would please Becky.
I could tell you some more of my mermaid story every day,
offered Sara.
You mean I could hear it just like the other girls?
Becky asked.
Yes,
Sara answered. Becky returned to the kitchen, warm, fed, and happy. Upstairs in her room, Sara was happy too. She was only a pretend princess. But she had found a way to give real gifts to a poor servant girl. A Little Princess, Chapter 6, The Diamond Mines. Sara always enjoyed receiving letters from her father. One day, Captain Crewe wrote with very exciting news. A friend from his school days had come to visit him in India. The man owned some land where diamonds had been found. He asked Captain Crewe to become a partner in digging mines to find more diamonds. Captain Crewe hoped to make a lot of money. Sara was delighted by the idea of diamond mines. She told Ermengarde and Lottie stories of mines filled with sparkling stones. Ermengarde loved the stories, and Lottie insisted on hearing them every night. Most of the other students were also very excited about the diamond mines. Of course, Lavinia was not. One day after classes were over, she sat by the schoolroom fire talking with Jessie. Other girls were talking or playing quietly nearby.
I don't believe in mines full of diamonds, said Lavinia. If there were truly mines filled with diamonds, lots of people would be rich.
Well, diamonds have to come from somewhere,
said Jessie.
I know, but Sara is just telling another one of her silly stories,
Lavinia replied.
Speaking of Sara,
Jessie said,
do you know what I heard? She likes to pretend that she's a real princess. She says that being a princess has nothing to do with how you look or what you own. It has to do with what you think about and how you act.
Jessie giggled and went on.
She wants Ermengarde to be a princess too, but Ermengarde says she is too fat.
Lavinia laughed.
Sara really is ridiculous. I think we should start calling her Your Royal Highness.
Just then, Sara entered the classroom, followed by Lottie.
There she is now, with that horrid little child,
said Lavinia in a whisper.
I suppose Lottie will be screaming about something in a minute.
Lottie joined a group of younger girls who were playing in a corner. Sara sat on the window seat and began reading a book about the French Revolution. She was soon lost in a story about a prison in France called the Bastille. Lottie started running and sliding across the floor. First, she annoyed Lavinia and Jessie by making too much noise. Then she fell and hurt her knee.
Ow, 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 my knee!
She howled. Some of the other younger girls started trying to comfort her, while other girls shouted at her to stop screaming. Lavinia stood up.
Lottie, stop that noise right now, you crybaby! If Miss Minchin hears you, she'll come in here. You'll ruin things for everybody.
If you're quiet, I'll give you a penny.
Jessie said.
I don't want your penny!
Lottie sobbed. Then she noticed a spot of blood on her knee.
I'm bleeding!
She started howling all over again. Sara didn't like being interrupted when she was reading, but she flew across the room to comfort Lottie.
Now, Lottie,
She said.
you promised that you wouldn't cry like this.
But Lavinia called me a crybaby!
Lottie said.
Come sit with me and I'll tell you a story.
Said Sara.
Will you tell me about the diamond mines?
Asked Lottie. The diamond mines? Said Lavinia, looking at Sara.
You're a nasty, spoiled little thing. I'd like to slap you.
Sara turned to Lavinia.
Well, I'd like to slap you, but I won't. We're both old enough to know better.
Yes, Your Royal Highness.
Lavinia said mockingly.
We are princesses, I believe. Or at least one of us is. The school will be very popular now that Miss Minchin has a princess here.
Sara felt the blood rush up into her face and tingle in her ears. Sara's game of pretending she was a princess was the joy of her life. It was a secret that she had not shared with many people, only her closest friends. Now Lavinia was making fun of her in front of everyone. Sara raised her hand and was about to slap the older girl. Then she remembered something. If you were a princess, you did not fly into rages, and you did not hit people. Her hand dropped by her side.
It's true.
Sara said.
I pretend I'm a princess so that I can try to behave like one.
Lavinia blinked and didn't know what to say. Often when she was dealing with Sara, Lavinia didn't know how to reply. But right now, everyone in the room was waiting for her to say something.
Dear me,
She said at last.
I hope you won't forget us when you're queen.
Oh, I won't.
Said Sara. She did not say another word but stood quite still. And then Lavinia took Jessie's arm and walked away. A Little Princess, Chapter 7, A Birthday Gift. The girls who didn't like Sara began to secretly call her Princess Sara. They used the name to mock her. Those who did like Sara also thought it was the perfect name for her. They used the name kindly, but never in front of her. Even Miss Minchin began to think of Sara as royalty. The headmistress told some parents that a real princess was attending the school. She thought it made the school sound like a sort of royal boarding school. To Becky, Sara truly did seem like a real princess. Every day, the servant girl finished her chores quickly so that she could visit her friend. Sara told Becky long and wonderful stories and gave her food.
I have to be careful about eating in my room, said Becky. If I leave any crumbs, the rats and mice will eat them.
Rats and mice?
Sara was horrified.
There are always rats and mice in attics,
said Becky.
But you get used to them, miss. I don't mind them as long as they don't run over my pillow.
Sara shuddered.
I don't think I could get used to them,
she said. Whenever Sara went out, she searched for special treats for Becky. One day, she brought back some meat pies. Becky's eyes sparkled when she saw them.
Oh, miss,
she said.
Those meat pies will fill me up. I mean, cake is nice, but it's not filling.
So Sara brought Becky more meat pies, beef sandwiches, and sausages. Becky began to gain weight. She grew stronger, too. Sara had no idea how much she meant to Becky. and it wasn't just because of the food. Sara always had a kind word for Becky and made her laugh every day. Becky's life had always been hard, and she had only rarely laughed or known joy. Now laughing with Sara made her feel as full as those meat pies did. She had something nice to think about every night when she went to bed. A few weeks before her 11th birthday, Sara received a letter. It was from her father, who didn't seem as cheerful as usual. He said that he was sick and also worried about the diamond mines. But he'd still managed to make wonderful preparations for her birthday. He had ordered her an expensive gift from Paris. It was another doll with beautiful handmade clothes. Then he'd wanted to know if a doll was still an acceptable gift for his daughter.
I'm getting very old,
Sara wrote back.
This will probably be my last doll, Papa. No doll can ever take Emily's place, but I will respect the last doll very much. And I am sure that the school will love her too.
In his bungalow in India, Captain Crewe burned with fever. When he received Sara's letter, he laughed as he had not for weeks.
How I'd love to have her arms around my neck right now.
When Sara's birthday arrived, the whole school was excited. After the morning lessons, the desks were all pushed aside. The plan was for Sara to open her presents in the schoolroom. Then everyone would go to Miss Minchin's sitting room for lunch. Sara returned to her sitting room for a few minutes before the party. There, on a table, she found a small package wrapped in brown paper. She opened it and found a square pincushion made of old red flannel. The pins had been arranged to spell Happy Birthday.
I bet Becky made this,
cried Sara. Sara turned over her present. Pinned to the bottom of the pincushion was a card addressed to Miss Amelia Minchin.
Miss Amelia?
Sara was puzzled. Just then, the door opened and Becky peeked into the room. She had a sweet grin on her face.
Do you like it, Miss Sara?
Like it?
Sara cried.
Of course I do. You made this all by yourself.
Becky nodded happily, and her eyes looked damp.
The flannel isn't new, but I wanted to give you something. I knew you could pretend the flannel was satin. I tried to pretend the heads of the pins were diamonds.
It's wonderful, Becky. But I'm puzzled by the card.
Miss Amelia had thrown it away,
Becky explained.
I hope it wasn't wrong to pick it out of the trash. It wouldn't be a proper present without a card.
Sara ran to Becky and hugged her.
Oh, Becky,
she cried.
I love you. I really do.
Oh, miss, said Becky. Thank you kindly.
Sara didn't know why, but a large lump had filled her throat. A Little Princess, Chapter 8, Bad News. The servants had decorated the schoolroom for Sara's birthday party. Miss Minchin and Sara led all the girls inside. 3 servants, including Becky, followed the procession. The servants all carried boxes of presents, which they placed on a table. Becky had forgotten herself in the midst of the excitement of the party. Now she was grinning at Lottie, who was wriggling happily as she waited for Sara to open her presents. Miss Minchin frowned.
You may leave now,
she told Becky and the other servants.
Please, Miss Minchin,
Sara said suddenly.
May Becky stay? I know she'd like to see the presents.
Miss Minchin put on her glasses and looked Sara up and down.
Becky?
She's just a child too, you know,
Sara added boldly. For a moment, Miss Minchin didn't speak.
My dear Sara,
she managed to say at last.
kitchen maids are not children.
Well, Becky is a child.
Sara repeated.
Please let her stay because it's my birthday.
Becky had been backing away, nervously twisting the bottom of her apron. The headmistress sighed.
Very well. As a birthday favor, she may stay. Becky, you must thank Miss Sara for her great kindness.
At Miss Minchin's reply, her face lit up.
I'm very grateful, miss.
She said, grinning at Sara. Miss Minchin waved her hand. It was in the direction of the corner near the door.
Stand over there, Becky.
She commanded.
Away from the other girls.
Soon Miss Minchin left the room, and all the girls rushed toward the boxes. Sara opened the biggest one first. Inside was the last doll.
Oh!
Groaned the children in delight. The new doll was truly magnificent. Lottie gasped.
She's almost as big as I am. She's dressed for the theater,
Ermengarde said.
Her cloak is lined with fur and she has an opera glass.
Here's her trunk,
said Sara.
Let's open it and look at her things.
Sara sat on the floor and turned the key. The girls crowded around her. Never had the schoolroom been so noisy. Sara held up each item as she removed it from the trunk. There were dresses, ball gowns, jewelry, hats, lace collars, and fans. Even Lavinia and Jessie were impressed by the contents of the trunk. Sara put a black velvet hat on the doll.
Let's pretend she understands that we're admiring her,
she said.
You're always pretending things,
Lavinia said in a superior tone. Sara looked up.
Yes, I am,
she said.
It's fun.
Well, it's easy to pretend if you're rich,
said Lavinia.
Could you do it if you were a beggar and lived in an attic?
I think I could, but it wouldn't be easy,
Sara answered. Just then, Miss Amelia came into the room.
Sara, your papa's lawyer, Mr. Barrow, has come to see Miss Minchin. Your birthday feast is ready in her sitting room. Lead the other girls there. Miss Minchin needs to meet with Mr. Barrow in here.
Sara did as she was told.
Go back to your work, Becky,
said Miss Amelia. Then she left the room. Becky stayed behind in the room for a minute. Miss Amelia had told her to go back to work, but Becky couldn't help taking another look at the doll. She picked up the doll's hat and then a coat.
To Mr. Barrow.
Suddenly, she heard Miss Minchin coming. Becky darted under the table. She hoped the tablecloth was long enough to hide her. The headmistress came into the room, followed by a small gentleman who looked rather disturbed.
Please have a seat, Mr. Barrow,
Miss Minchin said as she sat down. But Mr. Barrow was too fascinated by the large doll and her wardrobe to sit.
Such a fancy gift for a child.
Captain Crewe is a wealthy man,
said Miss Minchin.
His diamond mines alone.
Diamonds?
Mr. Barrow interrupted.
There were no diamonds in those mines. Never were.
What?
Miss Minchin stood up.
What do you mean?
It was a bad investment,
Mr. Barrow went on.
The late Captain Crewe...
Miss Minchin gasped.
The late Captain Crewe? You mean he's dead?
Yes, that's what I've come to tell you,
explained the lawyer coldly.
He died from jungle fever and stress caused by his business troubles. An old friend invested all Captain Crewe's money in the mines and then ran away. Captain Crewe lost everything he owned.
Miss Minchin dropped back into her chair.
Does this mean Sara is a pauper instead of a princess?
She cried.
Who will take care of her?
You're responsible for her now,
said Mr. Barrow.
She doesn't have a relative left in the world.
A Little Princess, Chapter 9, A Different Life. Miss Minchin turned white with rage.
I'll throw Sara out of the school,
She cried to Mr. Barrow, the lawyer. Mr. Barrow had moved toward the door.
I wouldn't do that, madam.
He replied.
People will think you're cruel. They won't want to send their daughters to the school.
Miss Minchin knew that Mr. Barrow was a clever businessman, and she herself was a shrewd businesswoman.
So what should I do with her?
She asked Mr. Barrow.
Keep her. She's a clever child. You can get a lot of work from her before she grows older.
I will get a lot of work out of her before she's older,
Exclaimed Miss Minchin.
I'm sure you will.
Said Mr. Barrow with an evil smile.
Good day.
As the lawyer left, Miss Amelia came into the schoolroom. Miss Amelia took a step backward when she saw the furious face of her sister.
Does Sara have a black dress?
Demanded Miss Minchin.
Yes, but it's too small for her now.
Said Miss Amelia, trembling.
Tell her to put it on anyway.
Miss Minchin said fiercely.
And tell her that her father has died. Then send her to me.
Miss Amelia gasped and sat down in a nearby chair.
Captain Crewe is dead?
Yes, and he has died without a penny.
Said Miss Minchin.
That spoiled, daydreaming child is left a pauper in my care. I'm getting rid of her carriage, her maid, and that huge birthday doll at once. Now go tell her.
But must I tell her now?
Miss Amelia asked.
This moment. Don't sit staring like a goose. Go!
Miss Amelia felt sorry for Sara, but she didn't dare to disobey her sister. She hurried away. Miss Minchin paced around the room. All year she'd been dreaming about Captain Crewe's diamond mines. She'd imagined a fortune being left to the school. And now, instead of looking forward to a gift from him, she would have nothing.
Princess Sara indeed,
she muttered. As she swept past the table, Miss Minchin heard a noise. It sounded like someone crying. She pulled up the tablecloth. There was Becky.
How dare you?
Cried Miss Minchin.
You've been listening.
I didn't mean to, ma'am.
Becky desperately tried to explain.
Poor Miss Sara. How will she manage without a maid? Please, may I wait on her?
No, she's a servant now.
Miss Minchin snapped.
She'll wait on other people.
Meanwhile, Miss Amelia spoke to Sara. The little girl refused to show any emotion in front of Miss Amelia. She ran to her room.
My papa is dead,
she kept repeating in horror. Finally, Sara put on her black dress. She picked up Emily and went to see Miss Minchin.
Put down your doll,
said Miss Minchin.
No,
Sara replied.
She's all I have. My papa gave her to me.
Miss Minchin glared at Sara.
You'll have no time for dolls now. You will have to work and improve yourself and make yourself useful.
Sara looked almost relieved.
Working will make things easier to bear,
she said.
You'll do whatever you're told,
Miss Minchin said.
You'll run errands and help in the kitchen. You'll help the younger children with their French lessons.
Oh, I can do that,
exclaimed Sara. The headmistress looked stern.
Everything will be different now. And if you don't please me, you'll be sent away. Remember that. Now go.
Sara turned to leave.
Stop,
said Miss Minchin.
Aren't you going to thank me?
What for?
Asked Sara.
For my kindness in giving you a home.
Dark thoughts had filled Sara's heart. Slowly, she took a deep breath.
You are not kind, and this is not a home.
Sara ran out of the room. All she wanted to do was go to her room and think. But Miss Amelia was standing at her door.
This isn't your room now,
said Miss Amelia. She was following Miss Minchin's orders, but she didn't like them.
Where is my room?
Asked Sara.
In the attic, next to Becky's room.
Sara slowly climbed the stairs to the attic. She opened the door to a different world from downstairs. Her new room had a slanting ceiling and a dingy skylight. The furniture looked worn and uncomfortable. Sara sat down on an old footstool. She hugged Emily tight, but she didn't cry. She just put her face on Emily and sat there, not making one sound. She was still sitting like that when Becky came in. The servant girl ran to Sara and hugged her.
Oh, Becky,
said Sara, at last letting out a sob.
I told you we were the same. Just two children. I'm not a princess anymore.
Yes, you are, Miss Sara,
Becky sobbed.
You'll always be a princess.
A Little Princess, Chapter 10, Working Hard. Sara spent a terrible first night in the attic. Her bed felt hard. The room was pitch black, and the wind howled over the roof. But there was something worse. Sara heard scratching and squeaking in the walls. She knew what that meant. Becky had told her about the mice and rats living in the attic. Sara pulled the thin blanket over her head and tried to sleep.
My papa is dead,
she kept whispering to herself.
My papa is dead.
The next morning, when Sara went down to breakfast, she saw that someone was sitting in her seat next to Miss Minchin. It was Lavinia.
Sara, you will begin your new duties at once,
Miss Minchin said coldly.
Sit with the younger girls and make sure they behave. You should have been here earlier. Lottie has already spilled her tea.
Sara's duties at breakfast were only the beginning. The headmistress knew that Sara was smart and could be sent on complicated errands. She could even pay bills. So soon Sara was sent out at all times of day and in any weather. Sara worked hard and didn't complain. For a while she thought this would make everyone like her. But the other servants were delighted at her downfall. The maids gave her the worst jobs to do. The cook always scolded her. It was convenient for them to have a new servant to blame for every problem at the school. Of course, Sara no longer went to any classes.
I'm afraid I'll forget everything I've learned,
she said to Miss Minchin.
Well, you could use the schoolroom at night,
the headmistress said grudgingly. Each night, Sara sat alone in the schoolroom, reading old books. As time passed, her clothes became shabbier. Miss Minchin told the other girls not to talk to Sara anymore. Sara now had to eat downstairs in the kitchen. Each day she worked hard, trudging through the wet streets carrying parcels and baskets. Her heart was breaking, but she was determined not to show it.
Soldiers don't complain,
she reminded herself.
So I will not either. I will pretend I am at war.
Becky was still kind to Sara. Every day she helped Sara to dress and undress. But Becky was so busy with her own chores, she didn't have much time to talk. One day, Ermengarde saw Sara coming down the hall. Sara was carrying a pile of clothes to be mended. Sara looked so pale and poor, Ermengarde wasn't sure what to say. so she blurted out the first thing she thought of.
Oh, how are you, Sara? Are you very unhappy?
What do you think?
Sara suddenly felt annoyed. She marched past Ermengarde without another word.
Ermengarde is just like the others.
Sara said to herself.
She doesn't really want to talk to me.
Whenever they met after that, Sara always looked the other way. And Ermengarde always felt too awkward and embarrassed to speak. But things had changed greatly for Ermengarde too. Without Sara, Ermengarde was lonely and miserable. She constantly made mistakes during lessons, and she spent hours by herself, just staring out the window. One night, when Sara returned to the attic, she saw a flicker of light under her door.
That's strange,
she thought. She opened the door slowly. Inside was Ermengarde. She was sitting on the footstool, dressed in her nightgown and a red shawl.
Ermengarde!
Cried Sara.
What are you doing here?
Ermengarde stumbled up from the footstool. She shuffled across the attic in her bedroom slippers. Her eyes and nose were pink from crying.
I couldn't bear it anymore,
said Ermengarde.
You may be able to live without me, but I can't live without you. Why won't you speak to me?
I thought you didn't like me. Everything is different now. I'm a servant,
Sara reminded her.
I don't care about that,
said Ermengarde.
Can't we be best friends again?
Oh, yes.
Sara rushed into Ermengarde's arms.
I've missed you.
Ermengarde looked around the room.
Sara, how can you stand living here?
Sara looked around the room too.
Other people have lived in worse places,
she replied.
Think of the prisoners in the Bastille prison during the French Revolution.
You could make up a story,
said Ermengarde.
That's a wonderful idea.
Sara felt her imagination stirring for the first time since her father had died.
I could pretend that Miss Minchin is the jailer. And Becky is the prisoner in the next cell.
Sara's eyes were glowing, and she was already starting to look more like her old self.
I will tell myself the stories, and it will be a great comfort to me.
I'll creep up here every night to hear the stories too,
Ermengarde promised. A Little Princess, Chapter 11, An Animal Friend. Lottie couldn't understand why Sara didn't wear pretty dresses anymore, or why Sara had to work now.
There's a new girl in your room,
Lottie said to Sara.
Where do you sleep?
Don't worry, I have a room,
said Sara. But she wouldn't tell Lottie where it was. Lottie was determined to find out. She listened to the older girls talking, and then she knew. Late one afternoon, she climbed the stairs to the attic. She opened a door. There was Sara, standing on a table and looking out the skylight.
Sara!
Lottie looked horrified at the bare and empty attic.
This room is so ugly!
Shh, Lottie,
Sara said quickly.
Don't cry or make any noise. You'll get us both in trouble. This isn't such a bad room.
Lottie bit her lip as she looked around again.
Why not, Sara?
Sara hugged Lottie and forced herself to smile, even though it had been a hard day. Then she helped Lottie to climb on top of the table so they could look out the skylight.
You can see all sorts of things from here,
said Sara.
Things that you can't see from downstairs. I wish someone lived in the house next door, but it's empty. If a person looked out the skylight in that house, we could talk.
2 sparrows twittered and hopped about on the roof.
I see birds!
Exclaimed Lottie,
I wish we could feed them.
said Sara.
I have a bun from lunch!
Lottie shrieked. She pulled a bun from her pocket. The 2 girls broke the bun into pieces and fed the birds,
Oh, I like it here.
said Lottie.
It's much nicer than downstairs.
Sara nodded.
It's so little and high above everything. It's like a nest in a tree.
She said.
In the morning, I can lie in bed and look right up at the sky. And if there are stars at night, I can lie here and count them. I'd like to live here too,
Lottie declared. Sara laughed.
It's time for you to go, Lottie. I don't want anyone to find you here.
Sara helped Lottie off the table and out the door. Then she sat and looked around the room. Without Lottie, it was much harder to pretend her room was nice. The bed was hard and covered with a dingy blanket. The floor was cold and bare, and the footstool with the injured leg was the only seat in the room.
Sometimes this is the loneliest place in the world,
she said. Just then she heard a little noise. A large rat stood quite close to her, sniffing the air. Another child might have jumped back, but Sara stayed still. The rat could smell some crumbs that Lottie had dropped. The rat looked odd and strange, like a gnome with gray whiskers.
I won't hurt you.
Sara said quietly.
Prisoners in the Bastille made friends with rats. I could be your friend.
The rat came closer and ate a small crumb. Then he snatched a bigger crumb and ran into his hole.
He probably took that home to his family.
Sara was delighted with her new friend.
I think I'll call him Mel.
Over the next week, Mel gradually grew to trust Sara. She gave him food and never frightened him. One night, Ermengarde came to visit. She sat on Sara's bed while Sara sat on the footstool.
I have a new friend,
said Sara.
But you must promise not to be frightened by him. He's a rat. A rat?
Ermengarde cried and pulled her shawl tightly around her.
He's very nice,
Sara went on.
I call him Mel. Watch this, Ermengarde.
Sara gave a low whistle, and Mel came out of his hole. She dropped some crumbs on the floor. Mel gobbled them up.
He always saves a few for his wife and children,
said Sara.
They live in a cozy nest in the wall.
Ermengarde was delighted by this story.
Tell me more.
But before Sara could say anything, someone knocked twice on the wall.
What's that?
Ermengarde's eyes were wide with fear.
Just the prisoner in the next cell,
Sara said.
Becky!
Ermengarde exclaimed.
2 knocks mean, are you there?
Sara explained. Then she rapped 3 times on the wall.
And 3 knocks mean, yes, all is well.
Becky knocked 4 times.
That means, good night, sleep well,
said Sara. Ermengarde beamed.
It's just like a story. Yes, you can be an escaped prisoner in the story,
Sara told her.
But now it's time to sneak to your bed downstairs.
A Little Princess, Chapter 12, The Large Family. Lottie and Ermengarde liked to visit Sara in the attic, but it was risky to go up there. They were afraid that Miss Minchin would catch them. So their visits were rare, and Sara was often lonely. When Sara went outdoors on an errand, she usually felt even worse. She had to hold on to her hat when the wind blew. The water soaked through her shoes when it was raining. When she had been Princess Sara, walking with her maid through the streets, people often admired her. They'd liked her lovely clothes and charming manners. But Sara had begun to grow very fast, and her clothes no longer fit her well. She learned quickly that no one on the street looked at shabby, poorly dressed children. There was only one thing that made Sara happy when she was outdoors. In the evenings, she liked to look in the windows of the houses she passed. She started to make up stories about the families inside. She especially liked the Large family, who lived on the same street as Miss Minchin's school. They were not big people. She called them the Large family because there were 8 children. The family had friendly-looking parents and many servants. It seemed that the Large children always had things to do. They played with one another and went out for rides in their carriage with their mother and grandmother. When Mr. Large came home from work, there was great excitement. The children ran to meet him, kissing him and dancing around him. Sometimes they pulled off his overcoat and checked his pockets for coins or small packages. One evening, several Large children were going to a party. While Sara was returning from an errand, she stopped on the sidewalk to watch them. 2 of the older girls, Janet and Nora, stepped into the family's carriage. The girls were dressed in white lace dresses with lovely sashes. Their brother Donald, who was only 5, was following them. Donald had sweet rosy cheeks and curly blonde hair. It was the Christmas season, and the Large children had been hearing many stories about poor children. In these stories, kind people gave money to the children. That afternoon, Donald had been moved to tears by just such a story. He vowed to give a poor child some coins. As he crossed the sidewalk, he spotted Sara. She was wearing a shabby dress and hat and holding an old basket. Donald thought she looked hungry. Sara was hungry, but not for food. She was hungry for the warm family life that he had. Donald walked over to the girl with the big eyes and thin face.
Here, poor little girl.
He took a coin from his pocket.
Take this.
Sara's face turned red. For a second, she felt that she couldn't take the money.
Oh, no thank you,
She said.
I don't need that.
Sara's voice sounded nothing like a beggar's voice. Janet and Nora peeked from the carriage to get a better look at the poor girl in the street.
You must take the coin.
Donald insisted.
You can buy food with it.
He looked so kind and honest. Sara knew he would be disappointed if she refused.
Thank you.
Sara tried to smile even though her cheeks were still burning.
You're a kind, darling boy.
Donald scrambled joyfully into the carriage. As it drove away, tears came to Sara's eyes. She knew that she looked odd and shabby. But until now, she hadn't realized she looked like a beggar. Meanwhile, the Large children were talking excitedly about Sara.
Oh, Donald!
Exclaimed Janet.
Why did you offer that girl your money?
Her face didn't look like a beggar's face,
Said Nora.
and she doesn't talk like one.
Besides, she didn't beg.
Said Janet.
I was afraid she might be angry with you. It makes people angry to be mistaken for beggars when they aren't.
Donald frowned at his sisters.
She wasn't angry.
He said firmly.
She said I was a kind, darling boy.
Janet and Nora exchanged glances.
A beggar girl never would have said that.
Said Nora.
She'd have said, "Thank you, little gentleman," and curtsied.
Sara didn't know it, but the Large children were now very interested in her. Their faces started to appear at the windows whenever she passed their house. They held many discussions about her around the fire.
She's some sort of servant at Miss Minchin's school,
said Janet.
I don't think she belongs to anybody. I think she's an orphan.
She's not a beggar, no matter how shabby she looks,
said Nora. And from then on, they called Sara the little girl who is not a beggar. A Little Princess, Chapter 13, The House Next Door. Sara liked to think that her doll, Emily, could understand her. Sometimes it even looked like the doll was about to speak. But Emily never said anything, and Sara began to have doubts. One night, Sara was cold and hungry. She needed someone to talk to.
I can't bear this,
said the poor girl, shaking.
I know I'm going to die. I'm cold and wet and starving. I've walked miles and miles today. Miss Minchin was in a terrible mood, and I saw some girls sneering at my shabbiness. Everybody in the kitchen has scolded me from morning until night.
Emily said nothing. Sara continued to tell the doll about her bad day. The cook had sent her on several errands, but Sara couldn't find the last thing on the list. So the cook refused to give Sara any supper.
And some men were watching me when my old shoes made me slip in the mud,
Sara went on.
I was covered with mud, and they laughed at me. I'm still covered with mud, Emily. Do you hear me?
Emily just stared straight ahead with her glass eyes and unchanging expression. Suddenly, Sara was filled with rage. She lifted a hand and knocked Emily to the floor. Then she burst into tears, sobbing loudly. This was rare for Sara, the girl who never cried.
You're nothing but a doll,
shouted Sara.
You've never had a heart. You don't care about anyone.
Sara hid her face in her arms and sobbed. But after a while, she lifted her face and looked around. Emily was still lying upside down on the floor. Sara picked up the doll.
You can't help being a doll,
Sara said.
You do your best.
Sara kissed Emily and put the doll back.
I'm very sorry, Emily.
Meanwhile, Sara kept hoping that someone would move into the empty house next door. The attic window of the house was very close to Sara's window.
It would be so nice to see someone pop up from the window one day,
she thought.
I could begin by greeting the person, and then all kinds of good things might happen.
One morning, after finishing some errands, Sara turned the corner. To her great delight, she saw a moving van in front of the house. Men were going in and out of the house, carrying furniture and heavy packages.
Someone has bought the house,
she exclaimed.
Oh, I do hope someone nice will peek out the attic window.
She wanted to watch the movers carrying everything inside. But she knew the cook would be angry if she stayed outside.
I remember thinking that Miss Minchin's tables and chairs looked just like her,
said Sara.
And the Large family probably has furniture that looks like them. Warm and cheerful armchairs and sofas. I wonder what I can learn about the new family from their things.
Later in the day, Sara was sent on another errand. The movers had put several pieces of furniture on the sidewalk. Sara noticed a beautiful table of carved wood. She saw a screen covered with rich embroidery.
These are beautiful things,
said Sara.
I think the new neighbors are rich. I hope they're nice.
Among the furniture was a lovely statue of Buddha,
Someone in the family must have lived in India.
said Sara.
I lived in India. I feel like we're friends already.
When she returned, Sara saw a handsome man with rosy cheeks enter the house next door. It was the father from the Large family. This made her new neighbors even more interesting. The father soon came out again and gave some orders to the movers. That night, Becky came to Sara's room. She had a bit of news about the new neighbors.
The owner of the house is an Englishman who lived in India,
She told Sara.
He's very wealthy, and Mr. Large is his lawyer. The owner has had lots of troubles, and now he's sick.
Sara nodded, listening carefully. A few weeks later, she saw Mr. Large and a nurse get out of a carriage. 2 male servants came down the front steps of the house next door. They helped a pale, thin man out of the carriage. His face was narrow and pained, and he was wrapped in furs. The male servants carried him up the steps of the house, and soon afterward, a doctor arrived.
He's very ill,
Thought Sara. And that was all she knew about the Englishman from India. A Little Princess, Chapter 14, A Little Visitor. Sara liked to watch the sunset from her skylight. One evening it was especially beautiful. The sky glowed with golden light.
It's a splendid one.
Sara said softly to herself. Suddenly, she heard an odd chattering sound. She looked toward the skylight next door. There she saw a dark-skinned man wearing white clothes and a turban. He too was looking at the sunset. The strange noise had come from a little monkey he was holding. Sara thought the man must be a servant. She also thought he looked sad.
Perhaps he's homesick,
She said to herself. It was often hot and sunny in India, but here in England the sun rarely appeared. He'd probably come up to the roof to catch a glimpse of the sun. The man suddenly looked at her, and she smiled at him. She had learned how comforting a smile could be. The man's face lit up, and he smiled back. At that instant, the man's grip on the monkey loosened, and the creature escaped from his arms. It ran across the roof and down into Sara's room. Luckily, Sara still remembered the language she learned while living in India. The man was delighted to hear someone speaking his language.
My name is Ramdas.
He bowed to Sara.
That monkey is nice, but he's a mischievous fellow. If you'll let me enter your room, I'll capture it.
Sara nodded, and Ramdas slipped through his skylight. He easily crossed the steep roof and dropped through her skylight without making a sound. Within a few moments, he had captured the monkey.
My master would be very sad to lose his little friend.
Ramdas patted the monkey.
Thank you, miss.
Ramdas spoke to Sara very politely. He treated her as if she weren't a servant. She noticed him glancing around her shabby room, but Ramdas pretended he'd seen nothing. Then he bowed once more and disappeared through the skylight. After Ramdas left, Sara thought about her life in India. Only a few years ago, she had been surrounded by servants who treated her with respect. That all seemed like a dream now. Sara knew that her life at Miss Minchin's would never improve. One day she might be a teacher, but her clothes would still be plain and ugly. She would still be a servant, and Miss Minchin would still make every day miserable. Then Sara realized something important.
Even if I am dressed in rags, I can still act like a princess.
She declared. This thought warmed her cheeks, and she stood up straight.
It would be easy to be a princess if I were dressed in golden clothing,
she told herself.
but it is a great deal harder to be a princess when I'm dressed like this. I can do this. I know I can. I must think like a soldier marching into battle.
The next morning, Sara was in the schoolroom. She had finished teaching her pupils and was putting away their books. She thought of a story about a famous king who had lived in disguise. A shepherd's wife had not known he was a king and slapped him. The woman must have been very frightened when she found out the truth about the man, Sara thought.
What would Miss Minchin do if she discovered that I am a princess?
Sara wondered. Meanwhile, Miss Minchin was watching Sara daydreaming. She hated the look on Sara's face. It was as if the child were living in a world far away. Full of rage, Miss Minchin walked over to Sara and slapped her. Sara was so stunned that something strange happened. She burst out laughing.
Why are you laughing, you rude child?
Miss Minchin demanded. Sara took a deep breath.
I was thinking.
Beg my pardon immediately,
said the headmistress. Sara hesitated.
I will beg your pardon for laughing,
she said.
but I won't beg your pardon for thinking.
What were you thinking? How dare you think?
Jessie and Lavinia giggled, and the other girls looked up from their books. Sara always had something strange to say to Miss Minchin. Sara blurted out the truth.
I was thinking what would happen if I were a princess and you slapped me, and how shocked and frightened you'd be when you found out.
Every pair of eyes in the room widened in surprise.
Go to your room this instant,
cried Miss Minchin.
Back to your lessons, everyone.
Sara left the headmistress shaking with rage, and the girls still whispering about her.
Sara is so strange,
Jessie said to Lavinia.
What if she did turn out to be a princess? I wouldn't be surprised at all.
A Little Princess, Chapter 15, Searching for a Child. Sara was fond of the Large family because they looked happy. But she liked the gentleman next door because he looked unhappy. The school's servants were always talking about him. Sara learned that the English gentleman had become ill after losing his fortune. He'd gotten his fortune back, but he was still sick.
His problems were connected with diamond mines,
said the cook. She glanced at Sara.
We all know their trouble.
That man was just like Papa,
Sara said to herself.
He felt just what my Papa felt, only he did not die.
So Sara grew even fonder of the sick gentleman next door. Whenever she was sent out at night, she stopped outside his house. She liked to peek into the house and see him sitting in his armchair, his forehead resting in his hand. She often wished him good night.
Perhaps you can feel my good wishes, even if you can't hear them,
she said.
I hope you'll get well and be happy again. I'm so sorry for you.
She went on her way, feeling comforted and a bit warmer herself. But she kept worrying about the man. He looked to Sara like someone who had a lot of trouble on his mind. Meanwhile, Mr. Large and his daughters Janet and Nora often visited the gentleman. The sick man's name was Mr. Carrisford. Mr. Large's real name was Mr. Carmichael. He was Mr. Carrisford's lawyer. One evening, Janet told Mr. Carrisford about the little girl who is not a beggar. He was very interested. Then, Ramdas told him the story of the monkey's escape. Ramdas described the servant girl's cold attic room and her hard, narrow bed. The story upset Mr. Carrisford. He was wealthy and comfortable, while children were cold and hungry.
I wonder how many of the attics in London are like that one,
he said to Mr. Carmichael.
How many young servant girls sleep on hard beds while I sleep on soft pillows?
My dear fellow,
Mr. Carmichael answered in a cheery voice.
you must stop thinking thoughts like this. Even if you had all the wealth in the world, you could not improve all the attics in London. You must focus your thoughts on becoming well.
Mr. Carrisford sat and bit his nails as he stared into the fire.
Do you think the girl I'm looking for is living in such a horrid place?
He asked suddenly. Mr. Carmichael looked at him uneasily. He knew that this kind of thinking was very dangerous to the frail gentleman's health.
I don't think so.
He said finally in a soothing tone.
That girl was adopted by a wealthy Russian couple.
I must find her.
Mr. Carrisford went on.
If she is friendless and penniless, it is my fault. She is the daughter of my dear friend, Captain Crewe.
Are you sure his daughter was sent to boarding school in France?
Mr. Carmichael asked.
Perhaps we're searching for the wrong girl.
I'm not sure of anything.
Mr. Carrisford bit his nails again.
Crewe and I talked mainly about the mines. Her mother was French, so I assumed she went to a French school.
The French headmistress pronounced the student's name Carew instead of Crewe.
Mr. Carmichael reminded him.
So it's possible that we are on the trail of the wrong girl.
We must find Crewe's daughter.
Mr. Carrisford clutched Mr. Carmichael's arm.
Help me find her.
Don't worry.
Said Mr. Carmichael.
I'll go to Moscow to look for the girl. If she's not the right girl, we will keep searching.
If I were able to travel, I would go with you.
Said Mr. Carrisford.
But I am too ill. I can only sit here wrapped in fur and staring at the fire. And when I look into it, I see Crewe's face gazing back at me, and he's asking me a question. Tom, where is my little girl?
Mr. Carrisford grabbed Mr. Carmichael's hand desperately.
I must be able to answer him.
On the other side of the wall, Sara was sitting in her room, talking to Mel the rat.
It was very hard to be a princess today, Mel,
she said.
It gets harder as the weather gets colder and the streets get wetter.
Lavinia had laughed at Sara's skirt, spattered with mud from the street. But Sara had not responded.
You can't snap at people if you're a princess,
she explained to the rat.
But it was such a cold afternoon, and it's so cold tonight.
Sara put her head in her lap.
Oh, Papa,
she whispered.
It seems like such a long time since I was your little girl.
A Little Princess, Chapter 16, The Beggar Girl. The winter was miserable. Sara was sent outside in the worst weather. There were days when she had to walk through snow. There were worse days when the snow melted into muddy slush. Those were days when the windows of the large family's house looked especially cozy. The study where Mr. Carrisford sat glowed with warmth and color, too. Meanwhile, Sara's attic was too dreary for words. Gray clouds hung low over the skylight. There were no sunsets. The servants in the kitchen were miserable too, and that made them crueler than ever. They treated poor Becky like a slave. One cold, rainy day, Sara was doing errands. Her shabby clothes and old shoes were soaked. For some reason, Miss Minchin had chosen to punish her, so the cook didn't give Sara any lunch. Still, Sara kept doing her errands. She decided to pretend that things were better.
I'll pretend I'm wearing warm, dry clothes,
She said to herself.
I'll pretend I have good shoes and an umbrella. And when I'm near a bakery, I'll find some money. I'll go into that shop and buy 6 hot buns. Then I'll eat them all up.
Some very odd things happen in this world sometimes. Just then, Sara had to cross the street. The mud was deep and cold. She walked carefully, looking at the ground. Just as she reached the sidewalk, she spied a silver coin. Sara picked it up. Then she looked around. She was right in front of a bakery. A cheerful, stout woman was putting a tray of freshly baked buns in the window. They were large, plump, shiny buns with currants in them. Sara could smell the warm buns.
Oh,
She sighed.
those buns look delicious. With this coin, I could buy 4 of them. But first, I must ask the baker if she lost any money.
Sara was about to enter the bakery when she stopped. A small, sad figure sat nearby. It was a beggar girl with big, hollow eyes. Her hair was tangled. Her face was dirty. She was wrapped in rags and had no shoes. Sara looked at the girl's red, muddy feet.
Princesses always help poor people.
She reminded herself.
That girl looks hungrier than I am.
Then she said to the girl,
Are you hungry? Very hungry, miss. I've had nothing to eat all day. Wait here.
Sara answered.
I'll be right back.
Sara went into the bakery. It smelled warm and delicious. The woman was about to put more hot buns in the window.
Excuse me,
Sara said to the baker.
did you lose this coin? I found it on the sidewalk.
No, the woman said. It was probably there for days. Keep it.
Then I'd like to buy 4 buns.
Sara answered. The woman went to the window and put 6 buns in a bag.
I can only pay for 4.
Said Sara. That's all right, the baker said. I bet you can eat 6. Aren't you hungry?
Yes, very hungry.
Tears sprang to Sara's eyes at the woman's kindness.
Thank you very much.
She whispered. She was about to tell the woman about the girl outside who looked even hungrier than Sara felt. But just then, several customers entered the shop. So Sara thanked the woman again and left the shop. The buns were already warming her hands. She put one in the beggar girl's lap.
Here, eat this. Oh my!
The girl exclaimed as she gobbled up the bun.
This is wonderful!
Sara handed her 3 more buns.
She's starving.
Sara thought.
I'm not starving.
And with a trembling hand, she gave the girl a 5th bun. The beggar girl was still eating when Sara turned away. Sara nibbled at the 6th bun, trying to make it last. It was dark when Sara reached her street. In all the houses, the lights were on. Sara stopped outside the Large family's house. She could see the children gathered around Mr. Large, and a carriage was waiting outside the door. A big suitcase was strapped to the roof. Sara stepped into the shadows as Mr. Large left the house. She didn't want anyone to see her.
Goodbye, Papa!
Shouted his children.
We'll miss you!
I wish I didn't have to go away,
he said.
I hope you find the little girl,
said one of Mr. Large's sons. As she hurried away, Sara wondered whom Mr. Large was looking for. Meanwhile, Mr. Large's carriage headed for the station. The train would take him to Moscow. That's where he hoped to find the little lost daughter of Captain Crewe. A Little Princess, Chapter 17, Secret Plans. The next day, a strange thing happened in the attic. Sara was out doing errands as usual. So Mel the rat was the only one who saw and heard what happened. Mel had left his hole and was looking for food in Sara's room. Suddenly, he heard a noise on the roof. Two men opened the skylight and then peered through it. One man was Ramdas, the Indian servant from next door. The other was a young man, Mr. Carrisford's secretary. Mel watched the two men enter the room through the skylight. Neither one made a sound. Mel was used to Sara by now, but the two strangers frightened him. He ran into his hole, but he kept an eye on the two men. The secretary had caught a glimpse of Mel's tail.
Was that a rat?
He whispered to Ramdas.
Yes.
Ramdas whispered back.
There are many rats living in these walls.
Ugh.
Exclaimed the young man.
I'm surprised the girl's not terrified by them.
She's not like other children,
replied Ramdas.
She's a friend to all living creatures. I often watch her from my skylight and see her talking to the birds. She's kind to humans, too.
Ramdas went on.
The servant girl in the next room comes to her for comfort. Then there is a blonde girl who comes to hear her stories, and a little girl who worships her. The mistress of the house treats her like an outcast, but the girl acts like she comes from a family of kings. She's a true princess.
You seem to know a lot about her,
the secretary said. Ramdas nodded.
I watch her closely,
he said.
Are you sure she won't come up here now?
The secretary asked.
If she finds us, she'll be frightened. And it would spoil Mr. Carrisford's plans.
She has gone out and probably won't return for hours,
said Ramdas.
Besides, I can hear anyone on the stairs. We'll have time to escape if necessary.
The secretary took a pencil and paper from his pocket.
Keep your ears open.
He began to walk slowly around the miserable little room, making notes. First, he went to the narrow bed. He pressed his hand on the mattress.
Hard as a rock,
he exclaimed.
The blanket is thin and the sheets are ragged.
Then he looked at the dark fireplace.
There hasn't been a fire there for days.
I've never seen a fire there,
said Ramdas.
It's always freezing in here. I don't believe the mistress cares how cold the girl gets.
What a place for a child to sleep in,
said the secretary. He noted the old table and bare floor.
Whose idea was it to help her?
It was mine,
said Ramdas.
I like to hear the stories she tells her friends. One night she pretended this room was warm, comfortable, and filled with beautiful things.
Ramdas had repeated Sara's story to Mr. Carrisford. The sick gentleman had not liked the way she was treated at the school. He began to think about making her dreams come true.
Do you think we can transform this room while she sleeps?
The secretary asked.
Of course, we'd have to replace her bed during the day.
I can do it all with the help of another servant,
Ramdas replied.
We'll be so quiet that she won't wake up. When she does awake, she will think that a magician has been here.
The secretary continued looking around. He made notes about the floor, the fireplace, the broken footstool, and the old table. He also remarked that a number of old nails had been placed in the walls. Ramdas smiled mysteriously.
Yesterday, when she was out, I entered the room, bringing with me some sharp nails. I pressed them into the walls, where we will need them.
The secretary nodded.
You can hang things on them.
He said. Soon the men were finished.
I think I've made enough notes. We can go now,
said the secretary.
It's a shame Mr. Carrisford has not found that lost child. He has such a warm heart.
If he finds her, his strength will return. He will be well again,
said Ramdas.
I'm sure of that.
Then the two men slipped silently through the skylight and across the roof. After Mel was sure they had gone, he came out of his hole. He sniffed around the floor. He didn't understand what the men had talked about, but he hoped they had dropped some crumbs. A Little Princess, Chapter 18, Hungry in the Attic. When Sara returned from her errands, she saw Miss Minchin. The headmistress had just come downstairs to scold the cook.
Where have you been, Sara?
Miss Minchin demanded.
You've been out for hours.
I've been doing errands for the cook,
Sara answered.
It was hard to walk quickly because the streets are so wet and muddy.
Don't make excuses and don't tell lies,
Miss Minchin shouted at Sara. Then she went back upstairs. Sara went to see the cook, who was in a bad mood because of Miss Minchin's scolding.
You're so late!
The cook was happy to have someone to shout at. Sara laid her bundles on the table.
Here are your things. May I have something to eat?
She asked softly.
Supper is finished,
The cook snapped.
There's some bread in the pantry. That's all you'll get this time of day.
Sara found the bread. It was old and hard and dry, but she ate it anyway. Then she climbed slowly upstairs to her room. She was glad to see a glimmer of light under her door. That meant Ermengarde had come to visit. She pushed open the door. Ermengarde sat in the middle of the bed with her feet tucked under her. She had her red shawl wrapped around her shoulders.
I didn't expect to see you tonight, Ermengarde,
Sara said.
Miss Amelia has gone out to visit an old aunt,
Ermengarde explained.
No one else ever comes and looks into the bedrooms after we're in bed. I could stay here until morning if I wanted to.
Ermengarde pointed to the table under the skylight.
Oh, Sara,
said Ermengarde in despair.
Look what my father sent me. More books.
Sara's mood brightened instantly.
Oh, these are beautiful books. I've always wanted to read this one about the French Revolution.
Well, I don't want to read it. I know he'll test me on all of these books, but I still don't want to read any of them.
Do you know what we could do?
Sara said eagerly. Her cheeks were flushed.
I could read the books, and then I could describe them to you. It would be like telling you stories.
That's a wonderful idea,
said Ermengarde.
I've been doing better since you helped me with my French lessons.
I've been helping Lottie with her math too,
Sara said.
Miss Minchin has no idea why we're suddenly so smart,
Ermengarde said. The two girls laughed. Sara suddenly startled and looked up at the skylight.
Did you hear something?
She asked.
No,
said Ermengarde.
It sounded like somebody was dragging something across the roof.
Sara said.
Maybe it was...
This time they both heard the same sound, but it wasn't coming from the roof. It was Miss Minchin's voice, and she sounded angry. Sara quickly put out the candle.
Miss Minchin is scolding Becky,
whispered Sara.
She's making Becky cry.
Will Miss Minchin come in here?
Ermengarde was in a panic.
No, she'll think I'm asleep. Stay still,
Sara whispered. It was very rare for Miss Minchin to come up the stairs to the attic. Sara could only think of one other time that she'd done so. But now she was angry enough to be coming at least part of the way up.
You rude, lying child!
Miss Minchin shouted at Becky.
The cook tells me things are constantly being stolen from the kitchen.
It isn't me!
Becky began to sob.
I'm hungry all the time, but I don't steal food!
Miss Minchin sounded out of breath.
You should go to prison for stealing that piece of meat pie!
She slapped Becky.
Go to bed!
It wasn't me!
Becky insisted. And again, Sara and Ermengarde heard the sound of a slap. Miss Minchin stomped down the stairs. Sara and Ermengarde heard Becky crying in the next room.
I didn't take it!
Becky sobbed.
The cook gave it to her boyfriend, the policeman!
This makes me so angry,
Sara said. She stood in the center of the dark room, clenching her fists furiously.
The cook is wicked and cruel. She's the one who's stealing, not Becky.
Sara lit her candle again.
Poor Becky is always hungry. Sometimes she eats crusts out of the trash.
To Ermengarde's surprise, Sara burst into tears.
Oh, Sara.
Ermengarde looked at Sara. For the first time, she noticed how thin her friend was.
I hate to ask this, but are you ever hungry?
Yes,
Sara burst out.
I'm hungry all the time. I'm so hungry right now that I could almost eat you. And Becky is even hungrier than I am.
Oh, I had no idea.
Said Ermengarde.
But I know just what to do.
A Little Princess, Chapter 19, A Party. Sara looked at Ermengarde, waiting to hear her friend's idea.
This afternoon, I received a package from my favorite aunt,
Ermengarde began. She told Sara that the box was packed with wonderful treats. Cake, meat pies, and tarts. Buns, oranges, and chocolate. There was even apple cider to drink. Ermengarde was very excited.
I could sneak downstairs for the box and bring it back here.
Sara clutched Ermengarde's arm.
Do you really think you could? We could pretend to have a party. And oh, won't you invite the prisoner in the next cell?
Yes,
cried Ermengarde.
Let's knock on the wall now.
Sara went to the wall and knocked 5 times.
That means come to my cell,
she explained. The next moment, Becky came through Sara's door. She stopped short when she saw Ermengarde.
It's all right,
said Sara.
Miss Ermengarde wants you to be here. She's going to bring us a box of food.
To eat?
Becky's eyes widened.
Yes, and we're going to have a party.
Ermengarde hurried away so quickly that she dropped her red shawl.
Sometimes just before things get to their worst, something wonderful happens,
Sara said.
It's like magic. Now let's set the table for the party.
But what will we use? Asked Becky.
Ermengarde's shawl can be the tablecloth,
Sara said.
I'll look in the old trunk I had when I was a princess. I'm sure I'll find more things that we can use.
Becky covered the table with the shawl while Sara opened her old trunk. Inside, she found some white handkerchiefs. Sara ran to the table.
Let's pretend these are plates made of finest china.
The girls decorated the table with flowers from a straw hat. They used some scraps of paper to make a tiny fire in the fireplace. Sara turned suddenly to see Becky standing by the table with her eyes shut. There was an odd look on Becky's face.
What's the matter, Becky?
Sara asked. Becky opened her eyes.
I was pretending it was a real banquet, miss. Just like you do. It almost worked.
Sara laughed.
Keep practicing, Becky.
When Ermengarde returned, she gazed around with delight.
Oh, Sara, you're so clever. It looks like a real party up here. It's like a queen's table,
said Becky with a happy sigh.
We're pretending to hold a banquet in a castle.
Ermengarde, you must be the princess,
Sara insisted.
No, that's your role,
Ermengarde said. Sara grinned.
Well then, let's begin the feast.
The girls sat down. They had just begun to eat when they heard a noise. All three sprang to their feet. Someone was coming up the stairs. And they all recognized the angry footsteps at once. When Miss Minchin threw open the door, her face was pale with rage.
So Lavinia was telling the truth,
declared the headmistress.
Something is going on up here.
Sara and Ermengarde looked at each other. Lavinia had guessed their secret and told Miss Minchin. The headmistress slapped Becky.
You're fired. You'll leave tomorrow.
Becky ran from the room. Sara stood quite still, but Ermengarde burst into tears.
Don't send Becky away,
cried Ermengarde.
My aunt mailed me the package. We're only having a party.
So I see,
Miss Minchin snapped.
With the Princess Sara at the head of the table.
She glared at Sara.
You're the one behind this. Ermengarde wouldn't think of such a thing. I'll deal with you tomorrow. You won't have anything to eat all day.
I haven't had much to eat today,
Sara said quietly. Miss Minchin ignored her and scolded Ermengarde.
You've brought your beautiful new books into this dirty attic. Take them back to your room. You'll stay there all day tomorrow, and I'm going to write to your father. What would he say if he knew where you are tonight?
Something in Sara's gaze got Miss Minchin's attention. Miss Minchin spun back toward Sara.
What are you thinking about?
She demanded.
Why are you looking at me like that?
Sara responded in a low voice.
What would my father say if he knew where I am tonight?
How dare you!
Miss Minchin flew at Sara and shook her.
Go to bed right now!
The headmistress picked up the books. Then she swept the food into the box and shoved it at Ermengarde. Pushing Ermengarde ahead of her, she left the room. Sara was left standing alone in her room. The last spark had died out in the fire. The table now looked like nothing more than some old handkerchiefs and fake flowers. Sara turned to her doll.
There isn't any party left,
she said sadly to Emily. Then she climbed into bed and closed her eyes. She didn't see the face peering at her through the skylight. A Little Princess, Chapter 20, A Dream? Sara was so hungry and tired, she drifted off to sleep quickly. She did not know how long she slept. She also did not know what woke her up in the middle of the night. It had been a noise. The skylight had made a small click as it closed. Now a man dressed in white crouched on the roof and secretly watched Sara. At first, when Sara woke up, she did not open her eyes. She felt too sleepy. Strangely enough, she also felt warm and comfortable.
I must be dreaming,
She murmured.
This is such a nice dream. I'll keep my eyes closed. I don't want to wake up.
Sara thought that warm blankets were heaped upon her bed. She reached out her hand and touched a down quilt. Then she heard a fire crackling.
Oh, this is so lovely.
She squeezed her eyes tighter.
I must make this dream last.
But she kept waking up. Sara finally opened her eyes and looked around her room. To her astonishment, she saw a real fire glowing in the fireplace. A brass kettle was bubbling and hissing. There was a thick red rug on the floor. In front of the fire stood a small table and chair. Upon the table were several covered dishes and a teapot. A bright lamp with a pink shade gave the room a rosy glow. Sara's bed was covered with new blankets. At the foot of the bed were a red silk robe, a pair of slippers, and some books. It looked to Sara like a fairyland.
This can't be real,
said Sara.
I'm getting out of bed now, but I must still be dreaming. Yet everything looks real.
She stepped near the blazing fire and spread out her hands.
It's hot! A fire in a dream wouldn't be hot.
Sara dashed around the room, touching the table, the dishes, the rug. She picked up the red robe and held it to her cheek.
It's warm. It's soft.
She almost sobbed.
It's all real. It must be.
She put on the robe and stepped into the slippers.
They're real too. I am not dreaming.
Sara almost staggered to the books. She opened the one on top of the pile and found a message. To the little girl in the attic, from a friend. She put her face down on the page and burst into tears.
I don't know who it is, but somebody cares about me. I have a friend.
Sara took her candle and slipped into Becky's room. She stood quietly by Becky's bed.
Becky, wake up!
She whispered as loudly as she dared. Startled out of sleep, Becky sat upright. Her face was still smudged with tears. She was frightened until she realized Sara had awoken her. Dressed in a beautiful red robe and holding a candle, Sara looked like a princess.
Come with me,
said Sara.
Becky, you must come at once.
Becky was still too dazed to speak. She simply got up and followed Sara, her mouth and eyes wide open. When they reached Sara's room, Sara pulled Becky into the warm, glowing room. Becky could not believe her eyes. She blinked and asked, "Is it real, miss?" Sara nodded.
It's real,
she said.
I've touched everything, and it's all as real as we are. Something magical has happened while we slept.
For the rest of the night, the two girls sat by the fire and enjoyed a hot, tasty meal. The covered dishes contained delicious soup. There were also sandwiches, muffins, and tea for both of them. Becky sipped the tea with pleasure. It was so delicious, it was not necessary to pretend it was anything but tea.
I don't know anyone who could have done this for me.
Sara murmured.
Whoever it is, Becky, I have a friend.
Do you think it could all disappear? Asked Becky.
Maybe we should eat quickly.
She crammed a sandwich into her mouth.
No, it won't disappear.
Sara replied.
Take your time.
The girls slowly ate their meal while they talked. Soon they felt warm, happy, and sleepy. When it was time to go back to bed, Sara realized that she had more than enough blankets.
Here, Becky. Take some blankets for your bed,
she said.
Oh, thank you, miss,
Becky said. Becky got ready to go. At the door, she turned for one last look at the room.
It's so beautiful,
she said.
If it all disappears tomorrow, I don't want to forget any of it.
A Little Princess, Chapter 21, More Surprises. The next morning, the whole school knew that Sara was in trouble. Everyone had heard that Miss Minchin wanted to fire Becky. But it was hard to find a good kitchen maid, so Becky didn't lose her job. Miss Minchin didn't send Sara away either. She had practical reasons for wanting to keep Sara at the school. Sara was teaching some of the other girls and could perform difficult tasks. And Miss Minchin didn't have to pay her a cent. But Sara was given no food that day. As usual, she was sent on many errands. She was even colder and wetter than the day before. At 10 o'clock, Sara wearily climbed the steps to the attic.
Oh, I hope the new things are still there,
she whispered. She opened the door to her room and gasped. The fire was blazing. Supper for two was waiting on the table. A number of new things had been brought to the attic. The ugly mantel was hidden by a rich tapestry. Colorful fabrics and fans were tacked to the walls, and a long box rested on the floor. It was covered with a rug and cushions to make a sofa.
It's like I'm living in a fairy tale,
exclaimed Sara. She knocked on the wall, and Becky immediately appeared.
Oh my,
said Becky. Her eyes were wide with amazement.
Where does it all come from?
I have no idea,
said Sara.
But Miss Minchin must never find out what has been happening up here.
Sara discovered that she had a new mattress and pillows. Her old mattress and pillow were now on Becky's bed, so Becky's bed was now softer too. From that day on, life became more wonderful. Every night there was something new in Sara's room. Pictures covered the ugly walls. New pieces of furniture appeared. A bookshelf was filled with books. Miss Minchin was as harsh as ever. The cook and other servants were still rude to Sara. She was never allowed to speak to Ermengarde and Lottie. Lavinia continued to sneer at her, but Sara didn't mind. She had her lovely room to look forward to all day. She also had a hot meal every evening. And Sara enjoyed having a special secret to keep from Miss Minchin.
If you only knew,
she thought whenever Miss Minchin scolded her. But Miss Minchin had noticed something different about Sara.
Sara is looking remarkably well,
Miss Minchin said to her sister one afternoon.
Yes, she used to look so starved,
Miss Amelia replied.
Why do you say that?
Snapped the headmistress.
She always had enough to eat.
Of course, Miss Amelia quickly agreed. She hated upsetting her sister.
There's something defiant about Sara.
Miss Minchin went on.
She's still acting like she's a princess. I find that most annoying.
One day, a delivery man came to the school. Sara was sent to open the door. The man handed her several packages. They were all addressed to the little girl in the right-hand room in the attic. Miss Minchin came downstairs as Sara was staring at the address labels.
Take those to the young lady to whom they belong,
said the headmistress.
Don't just stand there staring at them.
But they're addressed to me,
said Sara quietly.
To you?
Exclaimed Miss Minchin.
Well then, open them right now.
I don't know where they came from,
Sara said. She opened the packages and found all kinds of beautiful, warm clothing. Shoes, stockings, gloves, and a nice hat. There was even an umbrella and a winter coat. Pinned to the coat was a note, to be worn every day. Will be replaced when necessary. Miss Minchin was quite upset when she saw the clothing. Did Sara have a relative looking out for her? What if this person discovered how poorly Sara had been treated? He would be angry with Miss Minchin.
Well,
she said in a voice that was softer than her usual one with Sara.
Someone has been very kind to you. You might as well change into your new clothes. After you are dressed, you may come downstairs and learn your lessons in the schoolroom. There's no need to do any more errands today.
When Sara entered the schoolroom 30 minutes later, the girls whispered and stared. Sara was dressed in a beautiful dress, and she wore a ribbon in her hair. She looked just like the old Sara. Jessie elbowed Lavinia.
Look at Princess Sara.
Come sit here by me, Sara,
Miss Minchin said. Sara went to her old seat of honor and sat down. Then she opened a book and began to study. A Little Princess, Chapter 22, The Monkey Returns. That night, Sara and Becky ate supper together. Sara stared at the fire for a long time, looking thoughtful. "Are you making up a story?" asked Becky.
No, I'm thinking about the person who has done all this.
Sara gestured around the room.
Perhaps he wants to keep his identity secret. But I do want him to know how happy he's made me.
Suddenly, she noticed something new in her room. It was a box filled with notepaper, envelopes, pen, and ink.
Oh!
Sara exclaimed.
Why didn't I think of this earlier? I can write a thank you note.
And she did just that. The next morning, she left the note on her table. That evening, it was gone.
He found it,
Sara said to Becky. Sara felt happy that she'd written to her mysterious friend. She'd been able to tell him how thankful she was and how grateful Becky was too. That night after supper, she settled down to read one of her new books to Becky. Suddenly, they both heard something.
What's that noise?
asked Becky. Sara heard it again, a small scratching sound at the skylight. Sara opened the skylight. It was cold and snowing outside.
It sounds like a cat trying to get in,
she said. It had been snowing all day, and now, crouched in the snow, was a tiny, quivering creature.
Oh, look!
Sara cried.
It's the monkey again.
Becky ran over.
Are you going to let him in, miss?
Yes,
said Sara happily.
Come here, little fellow. I won't hurt you.
She put out a hand and the monkey leaped into her arms. Sara hugged the small creature.
Nice monkey,
she said, kissing its odd little head.
I do love animals, Becky. I'll let it sleep with me tonight. Then I'll return it to the sick gentleman tomorrow.
Sara made a little nest for the monkey, and it curled up like a baby and went to sleep. The next afternoon, Mr. Carrisford had visitors. 3 Carmichael children, Janet, Nora, and Donald, were sitting with him. They were trying to cheer him up. Their father was supposed to return from Russia that afternoon. Mr. Carrisford was very anxious for Mr. Carmichael to return.
Let's talk about the lost girl,
Janet said.
Is it true?
Nora asked.
Her father gave all his money to a friend to put into diamond mines. Then the friend ran away because he thought he'd lost the money?
but he didn't really lose it, said Janet. I feel sorry for the friend.
Thank you, Janet,
said Mr. Carrisford.
You're very kind.
Donald was making a lot of noise. Janet scolded him gently.
When you come to cheer up an ill person, Donald, you should talk quietly. I'm going to be quiet,
Donald shouted.
We'll all be as quiet as mice. Mice don't sound like that, Janet said.
It's fine.
Mr. Carrisford reassured her.
It keeps me from thinking too much.
Did you hear about the little girl who is not a beggar?
Donald was talking loudly again.
She has new clothes and... I hear a cab stopping, said Janet. It must be Papa.
They ran to the windows to look outside.
Yes, it's Papa,
said Donald.
But there is no little girl with him.
The 3 children ran to the door to greet their father. He told them to play with Ramdas while he talked to Mr. Carrisford. Mr. Carmichael entered the sitting room. Mr. Carrisford tried to stand up, but he was too weak. He slumped in his chair.
Do you have news of the child adopted by the Russian couple?
He asked.
Yes.
Mr. Carmichael began.
She's not the girl we're looking for. She's much younger than Captain Crewe's daughter. Her name is Emily Carew.
When he heard this news, Mr. Carrisford looked miserable.
Don't worry. We'll find the girl you're looking for.
Mr. Carmichael took a seat.
Perhaps we should look in London. There are plenty of boarding schools here.
In fact, there's one right next door.
Mr. Carrisford said.
Remember the poor servant girl Ramdas told us about? While you've been away, we've been helping her.
Just then, Ramdas entered the room.
Sir,
He said.
the girl from next door is here with the monkey.
I'd like to meet her.
Said Mr. Carrisford.
Bring her in.
Sara came into the room carrying the monkey.
Hello.
She said cheerfully.
Here's your monkey. It escaped again.
Then she said a few words to Ramdas in his native language. Mr. Carrisford and Mr. Carmichael looked at each other.
How do you know that language?
Asked Mr. Carmichael.
Oh, I was born in India.
Mr. Carrisford sat up so suddenly that he startled Sara. A Little Princess, Chapter 23, The Girl is Found. Sara stared at Mr. Carrisford, startled. His expression had changed. Was something wrong?
You were born in India?
He exclaimed.
Come here.
Mr. Carrisford held out his hand to Sara. She went to him and laid her hand in his.
Yes, I was.
And you live next door.
He went on.
But you're not one of the students.
I used to be a student, but now
A sad smile crossed Sarah's face.
I don't know who I am. I sleep in the attic with the kitchen maid. I run errands for the cook and do whatever she tells me. And I teach the little ones their lessons.
Question her, Mr. Carmichael.
The sick gentleman sank back in his chair.
I'm too weak.
The big, kind father of the large family had daughters. He knew just how to talk to girls Sarah's age.
You used to be a student?
Mr. Carmichael asked kindly.
Yes, when my papa first took me to the school.
Sarah replied.
Where is he now?
Mr. Carmichael asked.
He died in India.
Sarah said very quietly.
He lost all his money and there was no one left to care for me or pay Miss Minchin.
Carmichael!
Called out Mr. Carrisford.
Carmichael!
We must not frighten her.
Mr. Carmichael said quietly. Then he turned back to Sarah.
So you were sent up into the attic and turned into a servant, is that right?
Yes,
Sarah said.
there was no money and I belonged to nobody.
How did your father lose his money?
Mr. Carrisford asked. He took a few deep breaths to stay calm.
He did not lose it himself.
Sarah explained how her father had invested in his friend's diamond mines.
He was very fond of this friend, but he trusted him too much.
The sick gentleman gasped.
What was your father's name?
Captain Ralph Crewe.
It's the child.
Cried Mr. Carrisford.
What is he talking about?
Sarah asked Mr. Carmichael.
Mr. Carrisford was your father's friend. He didn't really lose your father's money. He only thought he did. He was terribly upset, and that made him very ill.
Oh, how awful!
Said Sarah.
You are now a very wealthy young lady.
Continued Mr. Carmichael.
We've been searching for you for a long time.
And I was right next door.
Sarah said in amazement.
I often saw you pass by my house.
Mr. Carrisford said.
You always looked so miserable. I couldn't find my friend's daughter, but I could help you.
Sarah was very surprised.
You sent the beautiful things to me?
Yes, with the help of Ramdas.
Then you're my mysterious friend!
Sarah gave Mr. Carrisford a big hug.
Oh, thank you!
You don't have to go back to the school.
He said.
Would you like that?
Oh, yes! But Miss Minchin will be upset.
Meanwhile, the headmistress had learned that Sarah was next door. She was very angry. She marched over to Mr. Carrisford's house, and Ramdas led her into the sitting room.
Go home at once!
Miss Minchin ordered Sarah.
I'm sure you're disturbing everyone.
No.
Said Mr. Carrisford. He patted Sarah's hand.
Sarah will be living here from now on.
Here?
Miss Minchin exclaimed.
Perhaps I should explain.
Mr. Carmichael said. He told her the story of the diamond mines.
We've been looking for Sarah. She's the heiress to a huge fortune.
Miss Minchin was stunned at this news. But she wasn't going to let Sarah get away now that she was rich.
Captain Crewe left Sarah in my charge.
The headmistress insisted.
She must return to my school until she's an adult. It's the law.
No, it's not the law.
Said Mr. Carmichael. He knew about such things because he was a lawyer.
I'm sure Sarah wants to return home with me.
Miss Minchin said.
You know I've always been fond of you, Sarah. If it hadn't been for me, you would have starved.
Mr. Carrisford lost his temper.
She was starving in your attic.
You're not fond of me.
Sara chimed in, looking at the headmistress.
The school is not my home, and you've treated me cruelly. I won't go back with you.
Fine,
Snapped Miss Minchin.
but you'll never see your friends again. I'll make sure that Lottie and Ermengarde...
Don't be ridiculous.
Said Mr. Carmichael.
Their parents won't let them refuse Sarah's invitations to visit here.
Miss Minchin turned to leave.
You'll soon find out what Sarah's like.
She said to the men.
She's dishonest and spoiled.
She spun toward Sara.
I suppose you think that you're a princess again.
With that, Miss Minchin returned to the school and started yelling at Miss Amelia. A Little Princess, Chapter 24, The Baker. That evening, the students gathered in the schoolroom. They were talking about Miss Minchin. She had been angry ever since she returned from the house next door, but the students didn't know why. Ermengarde rushed into the room with a note in her hand.
Sara sent a note.
She exclaimed.
Her fortune has been given back to her. She's going to live with the gentleman next door. What? What? How did this happen?
The girls asked eagerly. Everyone wanted to hear more from Ermengarde. Meanwhile, little Lottie burst into tears. She wanted Sara to stay at the school.
Sara says there really were diamond mines,
Ermengarde went on.
They were filled with millions of diamonds, and she owns half of them. She's invited me to visit her tomorrow, and I am going.
The girls chattered loudly about this news. Miss Minchin heard their noise and thought about scolding them, but she was not in the mood. Becky also heard them. She crept upstairs earlier than usual. Well, that's the end of that, she said to herself. Her eyes filled with tears as she climbed the last flight of stairs. She wanted to have one last look at the beautiful things in Sara's room.
No more fire or rosy lamp,
she thought.
no more supper or anyone telling me stories all night long.
She choked back a sob as she opened the door. But then she let out a low cry. A fire was blazing, and there stood Ramdas.
Miss Sara did not forget you.
He said.
Tomorrow you will go next door to live as her maid.
What? Becky could not believe what she was hearing.
And here's some supper,
said Ramdas.
Oh, thank you!
Becky shouted happily. As time passed, Sara became very close friends with Mr. Carrisford. The gentleman had never had a companion whom he liked as much as he liked Sara. One evening, they were sitting together as usual. Mr. Carrisford was reading. Sara was staring into the fire.
What are you thinking about, Sara?
He asked. She looked up, her cheeks bright pink.
I was remembering a day when I was hungry.
You were hungry many days.
Mr. Carrisford replied.
Which hungry day was it?
The day when I gave the buns to the beggar girl.
Sara told him about finding money in the sloppy mud outside the bakery.
You say that I have so much money now. Do you think I could use some to help the poor?
What would you do?
Mr. Carrisford asked softly. Sara hesitated.
I'd like the baker to feed any hungry children she sees. Then she could send the bill to me.
Mr. Carrisford instantly nodded.
That's a wonderful idea.
The next day, Sara and Mr. Carrisford visited the baker. The woman looked closely at Sara.
Have we met before? Her friendly face lit up. I feel that I remember you, but I cannot quite...
You once gave me 6 buns when I could only pay for 4,
said Sara. And then you gave 5 of them to a beggar child, the woman replied. I always remembered that. The baker turned to Mr. Carrisford. There aren't many children who would do that. She looked closely at Sara again. Excuse me, miss, but you look different. Your cheeks are rosy now, and you appear quite healthy.
My life has changed,
Sara said.
I was wondering if you could do something for me.
She explained her plan involving poor children and free buns. The woman watched her, listening with an astonished face.
Why, I'd be happy to do that, said the baker. In fact, you've already inspired me. You looked so cold and hungry, and yet you gave away those buns. I've often fed poor children since that day.
I wonder where that beggar girl is now,
Sara said.
Why, she's right here, the baker replied. I told her to come back whenever she was hungry. I gave her odd jobs and she turned out to be a good worker. Her name is Anne.
The baker went into the back room and brought Anne out. Anne was healthy and well-fed now. The 2 girls stood looking at each other for a minute. Then Sara held out her hand, and Anne took it.
I'm so glad that you're doing well,
said Sara.
The baker is going to give buns to poor children. Perhaps you'd like to be the one who hands out the food. After all, you know what it's like to be hungry.
Oh, yes, miss,
said Anne.
I'd like that very much.
The little princess was very pleased.
You'll quickly discover what I have discovered,
she told Anne.
There is great joy in giving.